On April 15, 1943, Captain Werner Schroer of Fighter Wing 26 radioed his wingmen over occupied Belgium. The Americans are flying barrels. The aircraft approaching his formation were unlike anything the Luftwaffe had encountered. Thick-bodied, round-nosed, with stubby wings disproportionate to the massive radial engine driving them. Compared to the sleek Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts that dominated European skies, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt looked like an engineering mistake. German pilots, who flew some of the most elegant fighters in the world, could barely suppress their contempt. They called it the Jabo, Jag bomber, fighter bomber. The name was half insult. The German assessment was correct about the visible characteristics and blind to the implications. The P-47 weighed nearly 8 tons fully loaded, the heaviest single-engine fighter of the war. It could not turn with a Focke-Wulf at low altitude. In the metrics of fighter versus fighter combat, it was mediocre. In the metrics that would matter in France in the summer of 1944, it was something else entirely. 8.50 caliber machine guns, 3,400 rounds. 8 guns firing together at 300 yards produced a cone of fire approximately 6 feet wide that nothing made of metal and fuel could survive. 2,000 horsepower, the ability to absorb damage that would destroy any other fighter. And a cockpit big enough, a detail the Germans found ridiculous, for 8-hour missions. Schroer's assessment would endure as long as his contempt. Within a year, P-47s would be doing something no one in April 1943 had fully imagined. Not aerial combat. On the roads and railways of France, one truck at a time, one locomotive at a time, one column of horses pulling 88mm guns at a time. Elwood Pete Quesada was not a man who laughed at the P-47. Quesada commanded 9th Tactical Air Command, the air component attached to Omar Bradley's 1st Army. He was 39 years old, a fighter pilot by training, and a logistical thinker by necessity. He looked at the P-47 and did not see the Focke-Wulf's rival that German pilots were comparing it to. He saw a weapons delivery system. 8 guns and 2,500 pounds of external ordnance, bombs, rockets, napalm, on an airframe that could absorb ground fire and keep flying. An aircraft built in factories that had been making automobiles 2 years earlier, maintained by ground crews with basic training, replaced at rates American industry made possible. The Germans were asking, how does this compare to a fighter? Quesada was asking a different question. What does this do to an army that cannot move? In November 1943, Hauptmann Hans Werner Lerche climbed into the cockpit of a captured P-47 at the Luftwaffe test establishment at Rechlin. His unit had received the aircraft intact. An American pilot had been forced to land in German-held territory. He carried the standard German assumptions. American factories were better at making refrigerators than aircraft. He flew for 90 minutes. What he wrote was dangerous, not because it contained tactical secrets, but because it contradicted the ideological position that German engineering was superior to American engineering. The Americans haven't built a crude aircraft, Lerche wrote. They've built a practical one. The huge cockpit was not a flaw. It was designed for pilots who would spend 8 hours in it. The robust construction was not inefficient. It meant aircraft came home after absorbing damage that would have destroyed a German fighter. His conclusion? Germany builds fighters for aces. America builds fighters for armies. And in total war, that difference is decisive. The report was filed. It was ignored. Major Josef Priller was a Luftwaffe ace with over 100 aerial victories. He had watched the P-47 arrive in European skies in April 1943 with the same professional contempt as Schroer. By 1944, he had revised his assessment, not because the P-47 had changed, because the war had changed around it. We laughed at them in 1943, Priller said after the war. Nobody laughs now. The P-47 he had laughed at was the same aircraft, carrying the same guns. What had changed was the target. In 1943, the P-47 had been a fighter. In 1944, Quesada had turned it into something the German military had no doctrine for, no defense against, and no equivalent of. Not a weapon that won dogfights, a weapon that stopped armies. Quesada's insight was not about the P-47 itself. It was about what the P-47 could do to an army that depended on roads. The German army in Normandy in 1944 was, in one specific and critical sense, a 19th century army. Not in its weapons. The Wehrmacht's tanks and artillery were the finest in the world. Not in its doctrine. German tactical excellence was the product of a century of professional development. But in its logistics. Most German artillery in Normandy was horse-drawn, not as a stopgap, but as standard practice. A German infantry division was authorized approximately 4,800 horses. These animals pulled the guns, the supply wagons, the field kitchens. They moved at a walking pace. They could not take cover when aircraft appeared. Field Marshal von Rundstedt's supply routes ran west through France on roads and railways. Every armored counterattack required fuel along those roads. Every barrage required shells along those roads. Every replacement, every loaf of bread, on trucks, on wagons, on horses, that had been standard military equipment since before Napoleon. Quesada looked at the same map and saw targets. He saw systemic targets. The roads themselves, the bridges, the railway junctions, the supply columns that moved along them. Not to destroy one column or one bridge, but to make the entire system unreliable. To create conditions where no German commander could depend on fuel arriving or reinforcements arriving, or ammunition arriving on any predictable schedule. This was the armored column cover doctrine that Quesada developed for the Normandy campaign. Groups of P-47s assigned to fly overhead of advancing American armor. A liaison officer in a specially modified tank with a radio linked to the circling aircraft. When the column encountered resistance, the liaison officer called in the aircraft. The response time was measured in minutes. German commanders were accustomed to air support requiring hours of coordination. American air support arriving in minutes, before the defending unit had time to disperse, was outside their operational model. Hans von Luck had fought on the Eastern Front and in North Africa under Rommel. In Normandy, commanding a regiment, he encountered something he had not fully experienced before. Enemy planes were swooping down uninterruptedly on anything that moved, he wrote in his memoirs. I could see the mushroom clouds of exploding bombs, burning vehicles, and the wounded who were picked up by retreating transports. The phrase that mattered was anything that moved. Not military targets, not identified gun positions or command posts. Anything that moved. A supply truck moving at noon. A column of horses pulling artillery at dusk. A staff car driving between command posts. A motorcycle messenger on a road in clear weather. The P-47 did not distinguish between military and non-military movement. In Quesada's doctrine, movement itself was the target. An army that could not move its supplies could not fight. An army that could not move its reinforcements could not hold a line. Von Luck understood this. He was watching his army being paralyzed, one vehicle at a time, by aircraft that arrived without warning and departed before the anti-aircraft guns could be brought to bear. He did not yet understand that what he was watching was not air support. It was the systematic destruction of everything that made his army an army. Quesada had spent the spring of 1944 working out the doctrine, radio procedures, and coordination. He had placed liaison officers in modified tanks because the critical variable was not firepower. The P-47 had that in abundance, but response time. A weapon that arrived after the enemy dispersed had not done its job. By D-Day, the system was ready. Within 2 weeks of landing, Quesada's P-47 groups had flown 26,000 sorties, claiming the destruction of 506 railroad engines and cars and nearly 1,300 vehicles. In 2 weeks. The German army on the other side of those statistics was trying to understand what kind of war it was now fighting. On July 29, 1944, The 405th Fighter Group found a German column trapped on a road between Rhine and Saint-Denis-le-Vêtu. The column had been attempting to withdraw through the gap between advancing American armor units. Elements of the 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions had closed the roads to the east and west. The Germans were pinned. Tanks, trucks, artillery, horse-drawn wagons, all of it compressed onto a 3-mile stretch of Norman road with nowhere to go. The first P-47s arrived at 3:10 in the afternoon. They did not leave until 9:40 that evening, 6 hours and 30 minutes. The pilots returned to their base to rearm and refuel, then came back and attacked again. Then again. The column could not move. It could not disperse. The terrain on either side, the dense Norman bocage, the earthen banks topped with hedgerows, funneled everything onto the road itself, where the aircraft could see it clearly. 2 days later, American ground forces reached the road. They found it impassable. On the road between Rhine and Saint-Denis-le-Vêtu, investigators counted 66 German tanks, 204 vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces destroyed. An additional 56 tanks and 55 vehicles were damaged. This was the result of one afternoon's work by one fighter group. Hans von Luck had not been at Rhine, but he had seen the same phenomenon from a different road. In his memoirs, he described the experience of commanding troops who could not move by day because the P-47s were always overhead, could not move by night because the roads had been destroyed, could not call for reinforcements because the reinforcements faced the same conditions on their way forward. I could see the mushroom clouds of exploding bombs, he wrote, burning vehicles, the wounded. What he was describing was the continuous background condition of Normandy in the summer of 1944. The P-47s were not a tactical weapon deployed at decisive moments. They were a persistent environmental feature, like weather, like terrain, shaping everything the German army attempted. An armored counterattack required fuel on a truck, on a road, under air observation. A barrage required shells in a depot connected to the front by a road under air observation. A defensive position required reinforcements connected to the front by a road under air observation. This was the logic of what Quesada had built. Not a single decisive engagement, a system of persistent denial that made the German army's standard operational methods unreliable, not occasionally, but continuously, in every sector, on every day that flying weather permitted. The 50th Fighter Group's action report for July 29th, the same day as Rhine, described a typical day. 3 squadrons, 23 missions, 46 tanks and 80 vehicles destroyed, 8 artillery pieces, approximately 80 Germans killed. Typical. Not a major operation, a summer day in Normandy. By the last week of July, 9th Tactical Air Command had flown 9,000 close air support sorties. Quesada's pilots claimed the destruction of 384 tanks, over 2,200 vehicles, and almost 100 artillery pieces. In 1 week. Each destroyed truck was fuel that would not reach a tank. Each destroyed artillery piece was a gun that would not fire. Each destroyed locomotive was a train that would not bring up the divisions von Rundstedt needed. The German army was not being defeated in the battles people remember. It was being defeated in the hours between battles, on the roads connecting the front to the rear, by pilots trained to find anything that moved and make it stop. Von Rundstedt had told Berlin in June that the greatest threat to his position was not the Allied ground forces. It was the Allied air forces. It was becoming impossible, he said, to bring up reinforcements by day. The German column at Rhine had not been careless. It had been attempting the only movement available, retreating through a gap before it closed. The roads were not safe, but standing still was not safe either. The column moved, and the P-47s found it. This would happen again. The conditions that produced Rhine were not a temporary anomaly. They were the permanent condition of the Western Front after June 1944. The Falaise pocket closed in August 1944. 2 Allied army groups had converged on a gap in the Norman countryside near the town of Falaise, trapping the bulk of 2 German armies, the 5th Panzer Army and the 7th Army, in an encirclement that was closing from 3 sides. Inside the pocket were approximately 100,000 German soldiers, their tanks, their artillery, their horses, their supply trains. They had one option: move east through the gap before it closed. Moving east through the gap meant moving on roads. Moving on roads in August 1944 in Normandy meant being visible to P-47s. Jack Dentz was a pilot with the 386th Fighter Squadron. He flew missions into the Falaise pocket during the closing days of August. What he found there was different from the typical interdiction mission. Not a column caught on a road, but an army trying to escape an encirclement, everything compressed into the narrow corridor that remained open. "We went in like flying artillery and just destroyed it all," he said afterward. "It was hideous. It was the only time I actually came home feeling sick." He paused. "I killed over 60 horses on just one mission. They had been pulling 88mm guns." That sentence captures something that statistics do not. The German army inside the Falaise pocket was not a modern mechanized force in its final hours. It was, in significant part, a 19th century army using 19th century logistics, trying to escape through a corridor watched from the air by the most effective ground attack aircraft of the war. The horses could not disperse. They could not take cover. They moved at walking pace, pulling the guns that were the backbone of German defensive firepower, on roads that every P-47 pilot in the theater knew to watch. Von Luck was inside the pocket. He had been fighting since Normandy began, watching his unit's strength decline not primarily through enemy ground action, but through the continuous attrition of air attack. His memoirs describe the Falaise pocket with the precision of a professional soldier who understood exactly what was happening. Enemy planes were swooping down uninterruptedly on anything that moved. Not periodically, not in response to specific military activity, uninterruptedly. This was the word that mattered. The P-47s were not responding to German operations. They were creating conditions under which German operations became impossible. An army that had to wait for air activity to pause before it could move was an army operating on the enemy's schedule. An army operating on the enemy's schedule in an encirclement was an army that would not escape. The gap at Falaise closed on August 21st. Approximately 50,000 German soldiers escaped through it before it closed. They escaped on foot, abandoning their vehicles, their artillery, their horses, everything visible from the air. They moved at night, in small groups, across fields rather than roads. They left behind approximately 350 tanks, 1,500 artillery pieces, and tens of thousands of vehicles. The roads through the pocket had become what one American officer called a killing ground like nothing he had seen in the war. German vehicles piled in ditches, horses dead in fields. The destruction so complete that Allied commanders touring the pocket afterward found it difficult to move their own vehicles through the debris. Von Rundstedt, relieved of command in early July and watching the collapse from the outside, sent a message to Hitler's headquarters that summer, asking what his successors were supposed to do about Allied air superiority. His answer, when pressed, make peace. The air situation had made the war unwinnable. Not the Allied ground forces, not the numbers of tanks. The P-47s on the roads of Normandy, and the system Quesada had built to put them there, hour after hour, on every road, in every sector, against anything that moved. The barrel-shaped aircraft that Werner Schroer had laughed at over Belgium in April 1943 had not become more elegant. It had not become faster or more maneuverable. It had become inescapable. The German army tried to adapt. It had to. An army that cannot adapt to conditions that are killing it will simply be killed. The Wehrmacht's professional officer corps, the product of a century of tactical development that every military in the world had studied, was not incapable of adjusting to new threats. The adjustment they made was to move at night. It was not a full solution. It was the only solution available, and it bought time rather than solving the underlying problem. P-47s could not effectively attack targets they could not see, and in the summer of 1944, American night attack capability was limited. So the German army shifted its logistics to darkness, supply convoys moving after midnight, reinforcements marching through the early morning hours, ammunition deliveries timed to the brief window between last light and the return of the P-47s at dawn. This worked partially for a while. Then it stopped working. Not because the P-47s found a way to fly in the dark, because the German army's requirement for movement exceeded what the available nighttime hours could provide. An army conducting active defensive operations required continuous resupply. The tanks needed fuel daily, the artillery needed shells continuously, the infantry needed food and ammunition and medical supplies at rates that a few hours of nighttime movement could not reliably deliver. The calculation was simple and devastating. A German supply convoy that moved only at night could cover perhaps 1/4 of the distance it could have covered in 24 hours of unrestricted movement. A defensive line that required 10 truckloads of ammunition per day now required 40 trucks to deliver the same load, because each truck could only make one trip per night instead of 4. Germany did not have 40 trucks for every 10 it had needed before. The German army was already stretched thin across the Western Front. The attrition of vehicles, not in battle but on the roads, had been continuous since D-Day. The trucks that remained were the survivors of 2 months of air attack, and there were fewer of them than the army needed even before the shift to night movement doubled and quadrupled the requirement. Von Luck watched this compression happen to his regiment. He had been a professional soldier since before the war. He had commanded armored forces across 3 theaters. He understood logistics the way a craftsman understands tools, not abstractly, but through the specific experience of needing something and not having it. What he needed by August 1944 was movement. What he had was a set of roads he could not use during the day and limited capacity to use at night, connecting him to supplies that were themselves being destroyed before they could arrive. He described the experience as fighting in conditions where normal military calculation had become impossible. You could not plan an operation around fuel that might or might not arrive. You could not plan a counterattack with artillery that might or might not have ammunition. You could not hold a defensive line with reinforcements that might or might not reach you before the American ground forces did. The P-47 had not made German military skill irrelevant. The German officers commanding in Normandy were as competent as they had ever been. Individual German units continued to fight with the tactical excellence that had characterized German arms since 1939. What the P-47 had made irrelevant was German military skill at the operational level. Not the skill to fight a battle, the skill to connect battles, to move the resources from where they were to where they were needed in time for them to matter. An army that cannot connect its battles is not an army. It is a collection of isolated engagements, each one fought with skill and courage, none of them adding up to a coherent defense, because the connections between them have been burned on the roads of Normandy by pilots trained to find anything that moved and make it stop. This was what Lerche had understood in November 1943, flying a captured P-47 at Rechlin and writing his report that was filed and ignored. Germany builds fighters for aces. America builds fighters for armies. The aces were still fighting. They were fighting well. The armies were being disconnected, one road at a time, until there was nothing left to connect. The statistics from D-Day to VE Day tell the story in numbers. From June 6, 1944 to May 8, 1945, 336 days, P-47 pilots in the European theater claimed the destruction of 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, 68,000 trucks. These numbers do not include the bridges. They do not include the rail junctions, the marshalling yards, the fuel depots. They do not include the roads themselves, the crater damage, the debris from destroyed vehicles that blocked movement for days after the aircraft had gone. They do not include what the destruction of these things prevented. A locomotive pulling a train of ammunition cars that does not arrive at the front is not counted in the statistics. The artillery barrage that does not happen because the shells did not arrive is not counted. The armored counterattack that does not happen because the fuel did not arrive is not counted. The defensive line that gives way because the reinforcements did not arrive is not counted. The statistics count what was destroyed. They do not count what was prevented. What was prevented was the German army's ability to fight a coherent campaign. Von Rundstedt had understood this before anyone else at the senior German command level was willing to say it plainly. In a communication to his superiors that summer, he had described the air situation in terms that left no room for ambiguity. The Allied air forces had made it impossible to conduct normal military operations. Supply movements were being interdicted systematically. The railroad network west of the Rhine had been so comprehensively attacked that it was no longer functioning as a military supply system. His exact words, preserved in the historical record, it had become impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine. One train. Not a reliable schedule of trains. Not the volume of trains required to supply an army in active operations. One train. The army that could not bring one train across the Rhine was the same army that had conquered France in 6 weeks in 1940, had driven to the gates of Moscow in 1941, had held the Eastern Front against Soviet pressure for 3 years. The soldiers had not changed. The officers had not changed. The tactical excellence had not changed. What had changed was the railroad. What had changed were the roads. What had changed was the specific, accumulated effect of 86,000 destroyed railroad cars and 68,000 destroyed trucks and 9,000 locomotives that would not pull another train. The P-47 pilots who had produced those statistics were not strategic thinkers. Most of them were young men in their 20s, trained to fly and to shoot, assigned targets each morning by intelligence officers who had studied aerial reconnaissance photographs overnight. They flew their missions, fired their guns, dropped their bombs, returned to their bases, debriefed, and flew again the next day. They did not know in any specific sense that they were preventing the German army from conducting operations. They knew they were destroying trucks and trains and columns. They knew the work was dangerous. From D-Day to VE Day, American tactical air forces lost thousands of pilots, most of them to ground fire, to the flak that every German unit deployed with professional skill. They knew the Jug was the right tool for the job. It could absorb ground fire that would have brought down a lighter aircraft. It could carry the ordnance that made each sortie count. It was big and it was ugly, and the German pilots had laughed at it over Belgium in April 1943. Major Joseph Priller had been one of the men who laughed. By the end of 1944, Priller had stopped laughing. In his post-war assessment of the P-47, he described it as the perfect fighter-bomber. Its guns never jammed. They never overheated. It outmatched every expectation that the Luftwaffe's initial assessment had set. We laughed at them in 1943, Priller said. Nobody laughs now. The laughter had stopped on the roads of France, on the locomotives that sat in their sidings, on the columns of horses that could not outrun the aircraft above them, on the railroad cars, 86,000 of them, that would never carry another shell to the front. The question that German commanders kept returning to after the war was not whether the P-47 was an effective aircraft. It was obviously effective. The evidence was on the roads of France and in the railroad sidings of Germany, and in the post-war interrogation reports of officers who had commanded formations that could not move, could not resupply, could not conduct the operations that their training had prepared them for. The answer was in Lerke's report. Lerke had flown a captured P-47 at Rechlin in November 1943 and written something that contradicted the ideological consensus. The P-47 was not crude, but practical. Germany builds fighters for aces, and America builds fighters for armies. The report was filed, ignored. Not because the German military was incapable of processing information, but because the information contradicted a framework deeply embedded in how German military culture thought about aircraft. German fighter doctrine was built around the individual pilot. The ACE system, the public tracking of aerial victories, the Knight's Cross and oak leaves and diamonds, awarded to men who had shot down dozens or hundreds of enemy aircraft, was not just a morale device. It was the expression of a genuine belief that air warfare was decided by exceptional individuals, and that the correct response to the challenge of air superiority was to develop and deploy more exceptional individuals. This belief had been correct in 1940 and 1941. The Luftwaffe's exceptional pilots had achieved results that justified the doctrine. By 1944, the belief was killing them. The P-47 had not been designed for exceptional individuals. It had been designed for armies, for pilots who would fly 8-hour missions day after day, who would take losses that individual ace culture would find unacceptable, who would keep returning to the same roads and railways, regardless of the flak, because the system behind them could absorb the losses and replace them. The kill ratio tells part of the story. From D-Day to VE Day, P-47s claimed approximately 3,750 aerial victories in over 746,000 sorties. Aircraft lost, approximately 3,500, most to ground fire. A kill ratio of approximately 4.6 to 1 in air combat. But the aerial kill ratio was the metric German doctrine valued: pilot versus pilot, aircraft versus aircraft. By that metric, the P-47 was mediocre. The relevant metric was what the P-47 did to the German army's ability to function as a coherent military organization. By that metric, the P-47 had no rival. Hans von Luck put it in his memoirs with the precision of a man who had lived inside the problem. He described not dramatic losses, but the accumulation, the daily attrition, the truck that did not arrive, the counterattack canceled because the fuel was not there, the position held for a day that should have been held for a week because the reinforcements had been caught on the road. Enemy planes were swooping down uninterruptedly on anything that moved. Uninterruptedly. That word contained the entire doctrine that Quesada had built. Not decisive attacks at decisive moments. Continuous presence. Continuous pressure. The P-47s were not waiting for important targets. They were treating all movement as an important target, because in a war of logistics, all movement was important. The German military doctrine of concentration, mass your resources, strike decisively, had no conceptual framework for an enemy that was systematically, continuously, uninterruptedly destroying everything that moved on every road in France. This was the gap Lair had identified. Aces fight in the air. They compete against enemy pilots. They accumulate victories. They become legends. What they do not do, what the ace system had never been designed to do, is spend 8 hours flying circuits over a road junction in France firing at trucks. That was not the role of an exceptional pilot. That was the role of a system built not to produce legends, but to produce presence. Quesada had built that system. The trucks on the roads of France were the result. Werner Schroer was still flying in the summer of 1944. He was not laughing anymore. The barrels he had mocked were above every road in France, and the roads were empty. The P-47 was not the only aircraft doing this work. P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, British Typhoons and Spitfires, all of them contributed to the interdiction campaign that strangled the German army's logistics in France. The P-47 was not unique in performing ground attack missions. What made the P-47 the central instrument of this campaign was not its weapons or its speed or its range. It was its survivability. Every German infantry division was equipped with 84 20mm anti-aircraft guns. A panzer division carried more. The ground fire American fighter-bomber pilots flew through was not occasional resistance. It was systematic, professional, and effective. From D-Day to August 7th, 9th Tactical Air Command lost 80 aircraft. 49% were lost to flak, 24% to small arms fire, only 7% to enemy fighters. The pilots who flew those missions knew the math. They flew the missions anyway because the P-47 gave them something that made the math survivable, an airframe that could absorb punishment and keep flying. Robert Johnson learned this on June 26, 1943, when a German Focke-Wulf put 21 20mm cannon shells into his P-47, cut his hydraulics, jammed his canopy, set fire to the aircraft, and wounded him. Another German fighter then fired several hundred machine gun rounds into his aircraft until it ran out of ammunition. Johnson flew back to England. He counted over 200 holes in the fuselage. A Spitfire or Messerschmitt receiving a fraction of that damage would not have returned. The P-47's massive radial engine, its redundant systems, its heavy construction, features German pilots had mocked as crude, were the reason Johnson's aircraft was flyable after absorbing enough ordnance to destroy any other fighter in the war. This was what Lerck had meant by practical, not elegant, not optimized for the metrics that an aeronautical engineer would apply in peacetime. Optimized for the specific demands of combat, the ability to take damage and continue the mission, the ability to return pilots who would fly again tomorrow. The German ACE system produced exceptional pilots. The German pilot who survived long enough to become exceptional was genuinely remarkable, skilled, experienced, aggressive. When he was killed, and at the loss rates of 1944, exceptional pilots were being killed. His replacement was someone with less experience, less skill, less of the accumulated knowledge that the ACE had taken years to develop. The American system produced replaceable pilots, not inferior pilots, pilots trained to a standard that made them effective in the role they were assigned, flying P-47s at low altitude over German supply columns, absorbing flak, delivering ordnance, returning to base, doing it again tomorrow and the day after that. They were not trained to be aces. They were trained to be present, consistently, continuously. On every road in France that the German army needed to use. Quesada's armored column cover doctrine was not built around exceptional pilots performing exceptional feats. It was built around ordinary pilots performing ordinary missions continuously, in numbers that German flak could not stop. For every P-47 that flak brought down, 3 more were returning to base and refueling for the next mission. For every German truck that survived 1 day's air attack, the P-47s would be back the next morning. This was the doctrine Lerck had described without knowing he was describing a doctrine. Germany builds fighters for aces. America builds fighters for armies. The aces won the dogfights. The armies won the war. Von Rundstedt, asked after the war what had defeated the German army in France, did not talk about Allied ground forces or American tank production or the invasion itself. He talked about the air. Specifically, he said, it had become impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine. One train. 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 68,000 trucks. One train. Hans-Werner Lerck flew his 90-minute evaluation of the captured P-47 at Rechlin on November 10, 1943, and wrote a report that nobody wanted to read. He was not a strategic thinker. He was a test pilot, a man whose professional function was to evaluate aircraft and describe what he found. He had no political axe to grind, no ideological position to defend. He had simply climbed into a foreign aircraft and flown it, and written down what the experience told him. What it told him was that Germany was going to lose the air war, not because German pilots were inferior, not because German aircraft were inadequate, because Germany was building weapons for one kind of war, and America was building weapons for a different kind of war, and the kind of war that was actually happening was America's kind. Germany's kind of war, exceptional pilots in exceptional aircraft achieving decisive results through individual excellence. America's kind of war, ordinary pilots in practical aircraft achieving systemic results through organizational presence. In Germany's kind of war, the ace was the decisive element. Train enough aces, produce aircraft worthy of aces, deploy those aircraft in the hands of those aces, and the enemy's numerical advantage would be overcome by the superiority of the individual German pilot. This had worked in 1940 and 1941. It had worked well enough in 1942 and 1943 to maintain the appearance of viability. By 1944, it was not working. In America's kind of war, the system was the decisive element. Train enough pilots to standard, produce aircraft that the system could sustain, deploy those aircraft in the numbers that the system could generate, and the enemy's individual excellence would be overcome by the superiority of the American logistics. Quesada had built that system. He had built it out of P-47s, the ugly, heavy, practical aircraft that Werner Schroer had laughed at over Belgium, and out of radio procedures and liaison officers in tanks and armored column cover doctrine and the specific understanding that an army paralyzed in its logistics was an army that could not fight, regardless of how excellent its individual soldiers might be. The Germans had the better pilots in 1944. In individual combat, ace against ace, Focke-Wulf against P-47, the German pilot often won. The kill ratios in pure air-to-air combat favored the German side. The Germans lost anyway. They lost because the war was not being decided in pure air-to-air combat. It was being decided on the roads of France at 3 a.m, when supply columns tried to move and found that the bridges had been destroyed and the road surfaces were cratered, and the detours led to roads that had been cratered too. It was being decided in the rail yards of Germany, where locomotives that would never be replaced sat in sidings, and the trains that should have been supplying the Western Front were not running. It was being decided in the fuel depots that P-47 bombs had set ablaze, and in the ammunition dumps that strafing runs had detonated, and in the horse-drawn artillery that Jack Dents and pilots like him had caught on the roads of Normandy and turned into burning columns of wreckage. Lerche had seen this coming in November 1943. He had written it down. Germany builds fighters for aces. America builds fighters for armies. The report had been filed. It had been ignored. Not because the German military was incapable of understanding what Lerche had written, but because understanding it would have required acknowledging something that the German military establishment was not prepared to acknowledge, that the kind of war Germany was fighting was not the kind of war that German doctrine, German training, and German production were equipped to win. Von Rundstedt understood it by the summer of 1944. His communication to Berlin that it had become impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine was the distilled version of everything Lerche had written 18 months earlier. One train. The finest army in Europe, the army that had conquered most of the continent in 3 years of fighting, reduced to a situation where it could not move one train across the river that formed its last natural barrier. Not because its soldiers had failed, because the barrels over Belgium had been practical, and practical, in a 4-year industrial war, was the only thing that mattered. The P-47 Thunderbolt was retired from American frontline service in 1947. 15,683 were built, more than any other American fighter of the war. In over 746,000 sorties, P-47 pilots claimed 3,750 aerial victories and destroyed resources that no post-war accounting has fully captured. The pilots called it the Jug, a name that captured both affection and honest assessment. It was heavy and ugly and exactly what it needed to be, which is something elegance rarely achieves. Werner Schroer lived through the war. He had called the P-47 a barrel in April 1943, and the name was not wrong. The barrel had been up there, over France, over every road that the German army tried to use, for every day of flying weather, from June 1944 to May 1945. He had stopped laughing by the end. Quesada survived the war and continued his military career, eventually rising to full general. The principle Quesada had worked out over Normandy, that air power's most decisive role was not winning dogfights, but preventing armies from moving remained at the core of American air-ground doctrine through Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and beyond. Hans Werner Schroer never became famous. His evaluation report of the captured P-47 at Rechlin in November 1943 was not published, not circulated widely, not recognized during the war as the accurate prediction it was. He wrote it because that was his job. He found that Germany was building the wrong kind of aircraft for the war it was fighting. He was correct. Hans von Luck wrote his memoirs after the war. He described the P-47 with the precision of a man who had spent months watching it destroy his army's ability to function. Not with contempt or bitterness, but with the professional respect of a soldier who understood what an effective weapon system looked like from the receiving end. Enemy planes were swooping down uninterruptedly on anything that moved. That was his verdict, not on the P-47's dogfighting ability or kill ratio, but on what it actually did. It moved without stopping. It was always there. It turned every road in France into a killing ground for anything that tried to use it. This was not what Schroer had seen over Belgium in April 1943. He had seen an ugly aircraft that could not turn with a Focke-Wulf. He had been right about that. What he had not seen was the system behind it, the factories, the training pipeline, the doctrine that made the ugly aircraft's ugliness irrelevant. 86,000 railroad cars not delivering their cargo was an army that could not fight. 9,000 locomotives not pulling trains was a railroad system that had stopped functioning. 68,000 trucks not delivering fuel and ammunition was an army disconnected from everything that made it an army. Von Rundstedt understood the final accounting. One railroad train could not cross the Rhine. The finest army in Europe, reduced to immobility by pilots who had been trained not to be aces, but to be present. The barrel over Belgium in April 1943 was not a crude aircraft designed by a nation better at making refrigerators than fighters. It was a practical aircraft, designed by a nation that understood what a 4-year industrial war required. It required presence, continuous, replaceable, sustainable presence on every road the enemy needed to use. Lerck had written this in November 1943 in a report that was filed and ignored. By August 1944, it was written on every road in France. In burning trucks and dead horses and the wreckage of 66 tanks on the road between Ralsay and Saint-Denis-le-Vêtu. In the silence of 9,000 locomotives that would never pull another train. In the one railroad train that could not cross the Rhine. Germany built fighters for aces. America built fighters for armies. The aces won the dogfights. The armies won the war.